What if I told you that the very qualities that make you powerful are the same ones silently destroying your life? Not your weaknesses, not your flaws, but your gifts, turned against you in ways so subtle you might not even notice until years have passed. And you're still stuck in the same patterns, just with more sophisticated explanations for why. If you're a Sigma INFJ, there's a good chance you're not failing because you're broken, but because you're sabotaging yourself with the same tools you use to understand everyone else. And the most dangerous part, you probably already know you're doing it. This is about the 6 ways the Sigma INFJ becomes their own worst enemy, and if you've ever felt like your biggest obstacle is the person staring back at you in the mirror, you need to hear this. Picture Icarus standing at the edge of the labyrinth, wings strapped to his shoulders, wax still solid in the cool morning air. His father Daedalus has warned him of the danger, the middle path between sea spray and sun's heat, yet Icarus feels the pull of altitude, the seductive promise of seeing further than anyone has seen before. This is the Sigma INFJ's perpetual predicament, not the apparent fall of flying too close to the sun, but something more insidious. They become their own worst enemy, not through weakness or lack of insight, but through the very qualities that make them powerful, through strengths pushed past their optimal threshold into territory where gifts become curses. Jung understood that every archetype contains its shadow, that the hero carries the seeds of their own downfall not in their flaws, but in their virtues taken to excess. The Sigma INFJ embodies this paradox with particular intensity, because their self-awareness, usually an asset, becomes the instrument of their self-sabotage. They see themselves too clearly, understand their patterns too well, and this very clarity becomes a trap. Where others stumble forward in blessed ignorance, learning through trial and error, the Sigma INFJ analyses themselves into paralysis, turning their perceptive gifts inward, until self-knowledge curdles into self-imprisonment. They are the snake eating its own tail, the observer who changes what they observe through the act of observation itself, and their tragedy is that they often recognize this dynamic whilst remaining unable to escape it. The ancient Greeks called this hamartia, the fatal flaw that brings down the tragic hero. But for the Sigma INFJ, the flaw is not ignorance or hubris in the conventional sense, but rather a peculiar form of sophisticated self-destruction dressed in the language of growth and authenticity. The first way they become their own worst enemy is through what might be called the tyranny of potential, the curse of seeing too many possible selves, and consequently, failing to commit fully to becoming any actual self. The Sigma INFJ possesses an unusually vivid imagination for alternative lives, different paths they might have taken or still could take. This is their NI function operating at full capacity, generating scenarios and possibilities so rich that potential futures feel nearly as real as the present moment. Where this becomes self-sabotage is in how it prevents full investment in the current reality. They are the person who pursues a career whilst perpetually wondering if they should have chosen differently, who builds relationships whilst holding part of themselves back in case a more aligned connection appears, who develops skills to an intermediate level rather than mastery, because committing to mastery in one domain means accepting limitation in others. The economist's concept of opportunity cost, the idea that choosing one option means forfeiting alternatives, becomes existentially paralyzing for them. Every choice they make is shadowed by awareness of what they are not choosing, every path taken haunted by the roads not traveled. This manifests practically in scattered energy and incomplete projects. They start writing a novel, but abandon it when they come up with a more compelling premise. They build towards partnership but pull back when they imagine a version of themselves who remained unattached and free. They develop expertise in psychology but feel drawn to study neuroscience, then philosophy, then spiritual traditions, never quite allowing themselves to go deep enough in any single domain to achieve genuine mastery. The result is a life that feels perpetually provisional, always one decision away from their real-life beginning. Kierkegaard wrote about this in his analysis of aesthetic existence. the person who lives in possibilities rather than commitments, who carefully preserves their options so that they never actually live. The Sigma INFJ falls into this trap with particular frequency, because their intuitive gifts make alternative possibilities so vivid that they cannot dismiss them as mere fantasy. Each potential path seems genuinely viable, genuinely them, and the question of which self to actualize becomes unanswerable, because it requires a kind of existential violence, killing off all the other selves they might have been. So they hedge, preserve optionality, and in doing so ensure that none of their potential selves ever fully materializes. They become their own worst enemy, not through choosing wrongly but through refusing to choose definitively, and years pass in this liminal space where everything remains possible precisely because nothing has become actual. The second way manifests through their relationship with vulnerability, specifically how their need for emotional safety creates conditions that make genuine intimacy impossible. The Sigma INFJ values authenticity and deep connection as core components of meaningful relationships, yet they simultaneously construct elaborate defenses against being truly known. This is not simple hypocrisy but a more complex dynamic. They want connection but only with people who can meet them at their depth, who can handle their intensity and complexity without becoming overwhelmed or pulling back. The problem is that they filter so aggressively for this rare quality that they eliminate most potential connections before they have a chance to develop. They meet someone and run them through an unconscious screening process, testing whether this person can hold space for their darkness, whether they demonstrate sufficient psychological sophistication, and whether they seem capable of understanding the nuances of the Sigma INFJ's interior world. At the first sign of limitation, the first moment where the other person responds conventionally or offers a platitude rather than genuine insight, the Sigma INFJ withdraws. Not dramatically but subtly, closing doors in their psyche that had briefly opened, returning to their default position of self-sufficient isolation. What they fail to recognize is that depth and sophistication in relationships are not prerequisites people arrive with, but qualities that develop through sustained engagement. By refusing to be vulnerable with anyone who has not already proven themselves capable of handling that vulnerability, they create an impossible standard. They want people to demonstrate they can hold space for the Sigma INFJ's full complexity, without being given the opportunity to practice that holding, to develop that capacity through actual relationships. It is like refusing to swim with anyone who cannot already swim perfectly, then lamenting that no one ever joins you in the water. Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we present to the world, and he understood that an authentic relationship requires gradually removing that mask, allowing ourselves to be seen in our undefended state. The Sigma INFJ intellectually understands this, but emotionally resists it. They have been hurt before, misunderstood and pathologized by people who could not comprehend their depth, and those experiences have taught them to protect themselves through strategic withholding. The tragic irony is that their protection mechanism ensures repetition of the very isolation that made protection necessary. They become their own worst enemy by constructing walls so sophisticated that even people genuinely interested in knowing them cannot find the entrance, and they interpret this failure as confirmation of their original premise, that most people cannot handle their depth, never recognizing that they never gave those people an actual opportunity to try. The third way emerges through what might be called the perfectionism of meaning, an insistence that their actions align with their values so completely that they become paralyzed by the impossibility of ethical purity. The Sigma INFJ operates with an unusually developed moral sensitivity, attuned to nuances of right and wrong that others miss or dismiss as overthinking. This sensitivity becomes self-sabotage when they demand of themselves a consistency that no human can actually maintain. They want their consumption habits to be ethical, so they research supply chains and fair trade certifications, until buying a cup of coffee becomes an exercise in moral philosophy. They want their career to contribute to human flourishing, so they reject meaningful, well-compensated opportunities that involve compromise with systems they find problematic. They want their relationships to be authentic and mutual, so they monitor their interactions for any trace of manipulation or selfishness, often finding it, and then retreating into guilty self-examination. The result is a kind of moral exhaustion that masquerades as integrity. They set standards for themselves that would be admirable if achievable, but become merely punishing given the complexity of actual human life in flawed systems. Consider how this operates in career contexts. The Sigma INFJ might reject corporate work because corporations prioritize profit over well-being. Reject non-profit work because non-profits often perpetuate the problems they claim to solve. Reject entrepreneurship because capitalism itself is ethically compromised. And reject academia because institutions are hierarchical and politically constrained. Having eliminated all available options through rigorous moral analysis, they end up underemployed or in work that does not engage their capabilities, then wonder why they feel unfulfilled. The philosopher Bernard Williams criticized what he called moral self-indulgence, the tendency to focus so intently on one's own ethical purity that one becomes ineffective at contributing to others' well-being. The Sigma INFJ falls into this trap by making their own moral consistency the primary project, rather than treating morality as a tool for navigating complex situations toward better outcomes. They become so invested in having clean hands that they avoid getting their hands into anything at all, and this avoidance itself becomes a kind of moral failure, the sin of omission, where they might have contributed something valuable if they had accepted that contribution would require accepting imperfection. Their idealism, which could be channeled toward genuine impact if tempered with pragmatism, instead curdles into a form of withdrawal where they remain pure by remaining ineffective. They become their own worst enemy by demanding of themselves a standard that ensures they never fully engage with the messy, compromised, ethically ambiguous world where actual change happens. The fourth way manifests through their tendency to pathologize their own needs as weaknesses requiring transcendence rather than legitimate aspects of being human. The Sigma INFJ internalizes cultural narratives about strength, independence, and self-sufficiency so thoroughly that they experience their own desires for rest, pleasure, or support as failures of character. This is particularly insidious because it operates beneath conscious awareness, hidden in assumptions so foundational that they are rarely examined. When they feel exhausted, their internal response is not compassion but criticism. They should be able to handle more. They are being weak, indulgent, and pathetic. When they desire connection or reassurance, they interpret this as neediness, something to be overcome through further self-development. When they want to do something purely for enjoyment without a productive purpose, they feel guilty, as if pleasure itself is a moral failing, unless it serves some higher function. This pattern intensifies because the Sigma INFJ has often survived difficult circumstances precisely through their capacity for self-reliance, through pushing past limitations that would have stopped others. Those survival strategies, once adaptive, become maladaptive when circumstances change. What worked during the crisis becomes a prison during relative stability. They have trained themselves so thoroughly to meet their own needs, to not burden others, to power through exhaustion, that they can no longer recognize when they actually require help or rest. The result is a grinding self-exploitation, where they demand of themselves what they would never demand of another person. They extend compassion freely to others, whilst treating themselves with a harshness that borders on cruelty. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion demonstrates that people who treat themselves with kindness actually become more resilient and effective, not less. Yet the Sigma INFJ resists this evidence, because it contradicts their fundamental belief that they must be harder on themselves than anyone else would be in order to compensate for their perceived inadequacies. The Greek myth of Prometheus captures something of this dynamic. Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, and was punished by being chained to a rock where an eagle ate his liver daily, the liver regenerating each night so the torture could continue. The Sigma INFJ imposes this punishment on themselves, perpetually sacrificing their own well-being for abstract principles or others' needs, experiencing this sacrifice not as noble but as expected, the baseline of acceptable behavior. They become their own worst enemy by treating their legitimate needs as problems to solve rather than as information to heed, and this approach guarantees eventual burnout or collapse, the point at which their body or psyche simply refuses to continue under such conditions. The fifth way emerges through their relationship with anger, specifically how they suppress or intellectualize this emotion until it either implodes into depression or explodes in disproportionate reactions. The Sigma INFJ typically has complicated feelings about anger because it contradicts their self-concept as someone who understands others deeply enough to maintain compassion even during conflict. When someone treats them poorly, their first response is not anger but analysis. They seek to understand what might be driving the other person's behavior, what wounds or fears might explain the mistreatment. This capacity for psychological insight is valuable, but it becomes problematic when it completely bypasses their own emotional response. They explain away behavior that deserves anger, rationalizing mistreatment until they lose connection with their own legitimate grievances. Anger exists in human psychology for a reason. It signals boundary violations, alerts us to situations requiring change, and provides the energy needed to protect ourselves or challenge injustice. By short-circuiting this signal through premature understanding, the Sigma INFJ leaves themselves vulnerable to repeated violation. They become the person others learn they can mistreat without consequence, because the Sigma INFJ will always find a way to excuse it, to understand it, to accommodate it. The suppressed anger does not disappear. Instead, it accumulates, building pressure beneath their calm surface. This manifests in several destructive patterns. Sometimes it turns inward, becoming the harsh internal voice that criticizes them for every perceived failure. Or it sinks into depression, the lethargy that comes when aggressive energy cannot find outward expression. Other times it erupts unexpectedly, disproportionate reactions to minor provocations that confuse everyone, including the Sigma INFJ themselves. Someone makes a small, thoughtless comment, and suddenly years of unprocessed anger come flooding out, leaving the Sigma INFJ mortified by their loss of control, and the other person bewildered by the intensity. Aristotle wrote about the virtue of appropriate anger, arguing that the person who never gets angry at injustice is as morally deficient as the person who gets angry at everything. He understood that anger serves an ethical function when calibrated correctly, when it motivates resistance to wrong, without overwhelming judgment. The Sigma INFJ struggles with this calibration because they associate anger with a lack of sophistication. As if truly evolved, people would transcend such primitive emotions. This is spiritual bypassing, dressed in psychological language, the belief that understanding should dissolve anger, rather than inform it. What they fail to recognize is that they can maintain their psychological insight whilst also honoring their anger. That these capacities are not mutually exclusive. They can understand why someone behaves harmfully, and still be angry about it, still set boundaries, still remove themselves from toxic situations. By refusing to accept their anger as legitimate information, they become their own worst enemy, disarming themselves in situations that require self-protection, only to wonder why they keep ending up in relationships and contexts that drain rather than nourish them. The sixth way manifests through their addiction to understanding, the belief that if they can analyze themselves and their circumstances thoroughly enough, they will discover the key that unlocks effortless change. The Sigma INFJ treats insight as if it were transformation, confusing knowing about their patterns with actually changing those patterns. They can articulate exactly why they self-sabotage, trace the origins of their defense mechanisms to childhood experiences, and explain in sophisticated psychological language precisely how their attachment style affects their relationships. Yet despite this encyclopedic self-knowledge, they continue enacting the same patterns, caught in what might be called the insight trap. They attend therapy or read psychology books or journal extensively, gathering more and more understanding about their inner workings, believing that the next insight will be the one that finally creates change. What they resist acknowledging is that change requires not just understanding but sustained behavioral practice that often feels uncomfortable or inauthentic in the short term. Knowing why they avoid vulnerability does not make them vulnerable. Understanding their perfectionism does not make them suddenly comfortable with imperfection. Analyzing their people-pleasing tendencies does not stop them from saying yes when they want to say no. The gap between insight and integration can only be crossed through repetitive action and practicing new behaviors until they become natural. Still, this kind of practice feels beneath the Sigma INFJ's dignity. They are thinkers, analysts, people who operate in the realm of ideas and understanding. The messy, incremental work of behavior change, the awkwardness of acting differently before it feels authentic, strikes them as somehow lesser than the elegant clarity of insight. So they remain stuck, collecting insights like trophies, whilst their actual life continues in familiar patterns. The Buddhist tradition speaks of the difference between intellectual understanding and embodied wisdom, acknowledging that you can know something conceptually without that knowledge transforming how you actually live. The Sigma INFJ tends to remain at the intellectual level, mistaking their sophisticated self-analysis for the deeper work of transformation. This is compounded by the fact that their insight provides a sense of progress even when nothing is actually changing. Each new understanding feels like movement, like they are actively working on themselves, and this feeling substitutes for actual change. They can spend years in this holding pattern, becoming ever more articulate about their issues without those issues actually resolving. Nietzsche wrote that we must become who we are, suggesting that self-knowledge is necessary but insufficient, that we must then act on that knowledge to actualize ourselves. The Sigma INFJ completes the first part brilliantly but stumbles on the second, and they become their own worst enemy, by allowing their capacity for self-understanding to substitute for the more difficult work of self-transformation, remaining perpetually in analysis, whilst life continues to unfold according to unexamined patterns they have spent years describing but never actually changing. These 6 patterns weave together into a larger truth about the Sigma INFJ's particular form of self-sabotage. They do not fail through lack of awareness or insufficient effort, but through applying their considerable gifts in ways that ultimately constrain rather than liberate them. Their vision of possible selves prevents them from committing to an actual self. Their need for safety and vulnerability makes genuine intimacy impossible. Their moral perfectionism paralyzes them, leaving them ineffective. Their pathologizing of everyday human needs leads to eventual collapse. Their complicated relationship with anger leaves them undefended against mistreatment. Their addiction to insight substitutes understanding for transformation. Each pattern represents a strength twisted into a limitation, a gift that becomes a curse when pushed past its optimal expression. The tragedy is that they often recognize these dynamics, whilst continuing to enact them, watching themselves with clear eyes even as they perpetuate their own suffering. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The Sigma INFJ inverts this problem. They make everything conscious but mistake consciousness for control, never recognizing that awareness alone does not grant the power to change. Integration requires not just seeing but doing, not just understanding but embodying new patterns, through repetitive practice that feels false before it becomes authentic. So if you found yourself in these patterns, recognizing with uncomfortable clarity the ways you have been your own obstacle, the question becomes not just what will you understand next but what will you actually do differently. What new behavior will you practice until it becomes natural? What risk will you take despite your sophisticated objections? The Sigma INFJ's liberation lies not in deeper analysis but in simpler action, not in understanding more, but in accepting that understanding has limits, that at some point you must step into the unknown, not with a perfect map, but with a willingness to be awkward, vulnerable, and occasionally wrong. Will you take that step, or will you remain in the labyrinth of your own mind, wings strapped to your shoulders but never quite launching into flight, because you are still analyzing optimal altitude, still calculating the precise middle path between sea and sun, still preparing for a journey that only begins when preparation ends and actual movement starts? If any of these patterns hit uncomfortably close to home, if you found yourself wincing with recognition at your own sophisticated self-sabotage, then you're exactly who this channel is for. We explore the shadow side of depth, the places where self-awareness becomes a trap rather than a tool, and the path from insight to actual transformation. Subscribe if you're ready to move beyond just understanding yourself to actually changing the patterns that keep you stuck. Here's my challenge to you. Pick one of these 6 patterns, the one that resonated most painfully, and in the comments, tell me not what you understand about it, but what you're actually going to do differently this week. 1 concrete action. No analysis, just the behavior you're committing to practice. I'll be reading every response. Sometimes the act of public commitment is what finally moves us from knowing to doing. Until next time, stop analyzing and start living.